good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this. This is the first TBI talks of our autumn seminar series. So thank you for joining us. My name is Ian Mulheirn. I'm the Executive Director for UK Policy at the Tony Blair Institute, and we're talking today about essential work to good work. How do we achieve security in a post-COVID labour market? What we're facing now as we approach the autumn is the furlough scheme winding up and the prospect of a very significant rise in unemployment. Some people think to potentially record levels, or levels not seen for many, many years. And we contrast that with January, even, where we had unemployment at record lows that we hadn't really seen since the first oil shock in the 1970s. But that's apparent success in the labour market was one that the pandemic has since revealed was built on a flexibility that carried with it significant social costs, risk transferred onto individuals, a growth in sort of informal forms of unemployment. And that raises the question of whether we, in tackling this unemployment crisis, whether returning to the status quo ante is really the right thing to be aiming for. So as we address the unemployment crisis, is now the time to rethink how we do it and to rethink our labour market. Now, we shouldn't underestimate the cost of long-term unemployment. Nobody wants to return to the experience of the 80s and the 90s recessions with significant rises of hugely damaging long-term unemployment. So the question really for today is the good work agenda something that we have to grapple with now? Or is there a need to prioritise the quantity of jobs over the quality of them during this acute phase of the crisis as unemployment starts to mount? And how does government policy, including things like the Kickstarter scheme, factor into that? How does it measure up to those goals? Now, we've got an excellent panel of speakers to kick us off and get our discussion underway this afternoon. We will hear from Stella Creasy, MP for Walthamstow, and Stella has been campaigning for many of the people at the sharp end of that flexible labour market in recent months, particularly. We'll hear from Martin Sandbu of the FT, and Martin is the author of a new book called The Economics of Belonging, which many of the themes he will touch upon in his comments. And we'll hear also first from Tony Wilson, who is the director of the Institute for Employment Studies. And Tony and his colleagues have been doing a huge amount of work about the policy response that's needed in the immediate term. And he's the go-to man if you want to know what is happening in the labour market at the moment. So we will hear, first of all, from the three of our speakers for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll get into Q&A. So as and when questions pop up in your mind, please do type them into the Q&A box, and we'll take groups of questions when we get to Q&A, hopefully somewhat themed at least, and put them to our panelists. So with that, I will hand over first, Tony, to you to give us an overview and kick us off.
Great, thank you, Ian, and thanks for inviting me to join this webinar. So I'm going to cover three things, I think. Firstly, talk a bit about the impacts of the crisis so far, the sort of first phase of the crisis. Secondly, what I think may happen next. And then thirdly, some thoughts on what we might do about that. So the first point, the crisis so far. So I think the first point to make is I think the government has done a really good job in managing to protect and minimise job losses falling out of the immediate impacts of the pandemic, and in particular through a job retention scheme and also the self-employment income support scheme. And in all, more than 10 million workers benefited from one or other of those two initiatives. However, notwithstanding that, we think there's been about 1 million fall in paid employment, about 3/4 of that employees, and about 1/4 in self-employment. And that has particularly affected the most vulnerable, those in the most insecure employment and those who are otherwise most disadvantaged. And actually, in work we're doing right now, which we'll be publishing next month with for the Standard Life Foundation, we've been doing work to interviewing people in those circumstances to understand the impacts of the crisis on them. And this has very much borne this out. So we've spoken to people who felt that they should have been entitled to support through a job retention scheme but weren't given access to it, people who weren't given the opportunity but saw their hours reduced, or people who otherwise fell out of work, who lost their jobs. And sorts of reasons why people weren't getting access to job retention scheme was, disputes over whether they were entitled, whether they started at the right time, employers saying they didn't have their employment records to enable them to calculate their entitlement, or saying even that work was available if they would come in and take it and work. So the first phase has been characterised by managing to shelter and insulate workers for the most part in general from the worst impacts of the crisis, but the most vulnerable losing out. And that million fall in paid employment goes way beyond anything we've seen in any previous crisis, the speed and scale of that fall. I think now, though, we're definitely moving into a different phase, which is going to feel much more like a deep recession, because we are in a deep recession. That's going to be characterised by very high levels of redundancies. Now, we'll be publishing something on Monday on this, and notifications to the insolvency service are running at about double, notifications of redundancies at about double the level they were in the last recession. And we think there's going to be about 500,000 job losses, redundancies in the autumn, which will far exceed what we saw in 2008-9, which was about 300,000 at peak. At the same time, hiring is pretty subdued. Vacancies are running at about one third below, new vacancies, one third below where they were at the same time last year. And this is a combination of uncertainty and low demand, but also because employers are bringing back people who were on furlough. And this has created a lot of spare capacity. But unfortunately, those people are coming back often with fewer hours, less pay, and in some cases with less secure terms and conditions. And all of this is going to have really significant implications for household incomes, for productivity, but also for people's well-being and their health and the communities they live in. So, this is a pretty depressing picture at the moment. But the question is, what do we do about it? And focusing in particular on the sort of question today about how we can promote good work and good quality work, I think there's probably 4 or 5 things that we need to do. Firstly, I think it's worth saying before this, though, that I think all other things being equal, if we had to make the choice, we would rather that there were, a lot of us in the labour force were sharing the pain with lower pay and reduced hours, rather than some of us being significantly worse off through high unemployment. And so what happened in the last recession was that unemployment didn't increase as much as it may have done, but we did see significant reductions in hours and earnings. What we want to avoid is going back to the sort of circumstances we had in the 80s and 90s, of very, very high unemployment, mass unemployment, and long-term sort of scarring impacts of that. But I think there's clearly more we can do to promote job security and job quality, even if we can't avert the recession or the crisis that we're in. So a couple of things. Firstly, some of this clearly is about legislation. It's about how we enforce the law as well. Now, the Taylor Review set a lot of this out, and the government's Good Work Plan set this out too. But ensuring that people have the right to more stable contracts, day one statements of rights, a single enforcement body, better enforcement of the law, all, I think, really important for providing a stronger basis for employment in the future. And I think in particular, the point about stable contracts needs to be an entitlement rather than a right to request. Secondly, though, we also need, I think, a much stronger worker voice, and to address the one-sided flexibility that exists in the labour market at the moment. And again, we've seen this really clearly in the research that we've been doing, looking at, in particular, in this case, at people's returns to work and how concerns about health and safety at work have been addressed. And we've seen, for example, in the work with Standard Life Foundation, many good examples in retail of supporting workers and of ensuring social distancing and minimising risk, but also really significant concerns, particularly in hospitality, with access to protective equipment being low or non-existent, and concerns about distancing, but even in social care and residential and domiciliary care, where people have often felt that they've had to go to work and not been able to address legitimate health concerns or social distancing concerns. And this is symptomatic, I think, of a wider issue about the imbalance of power between workers and their employers. But I think we also need a much stronger safety net, clearly, both for those who fall out of work, but I think as importantly, where people are seeing their hours reduce, ensuring that they've got financial support through the benefit system to help to top up incomes for low-income households. And tax credits played that role in the last recession very well. Universal credit is less able to do that, and I think we will need to address that. But just the final point really is around ensuring that we can get to a point where we're getting back to growth and we're stimulating new job creation and new investment as quickly as we can. And that ultimately is about a set of, wider set of issues and drivers, and ensuring that we can get back to growth and regrow the economy. In particular, I think that means trying to not make a mess of Brexit, clearly, so that we can create the conditions for private investment, ensuring that the public sector continues to invest and we don't make the same mistakes we did after 2010. But I think also looking at how we can reduce labour costs for employers. And in particular, I think that means looking at employer national insurance and other costs so that employers have a strong incentive as possible to create jobs. Final point, I think government must lead by example in all of this. And we'll talk about Kickstart in this session, but ensuring that Kickstart jobs are quality jobs and the Public Employment Service Job Centre Plus is supporting people into quality jobs and working with employers to create those jobs is going to be key. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. And let's touch on the Kickstart point that you just raised. I mean, what is your sense on how that policy is shaping up, and in the kind of quantity quality spectrum, and how would you do it differently to meet some of the things you just outlined?
So I think there's definitely a risk of never mind the quality, feel the width. At the moment, the government has set a really ambitious target, 350,000 jobs in 18 months. Future Jobs Fund created 100,000 jobs in the same sort of time, and it's often compared with that. I think it's going to be a very different beast. At the moment, the guidance where if employers are applying for Kickstart, the question you need to answer, the application process is essentially 3 questions. Tell us the jobs you'll create. Tell us how you'll provide employability support to individuals, and tell us how it's going to be an additional job. The bar is at the moment very, very low for whether the jobs are suitable, whether the level of support that's available, and the support that will be available to transition into better jobs. But so I do think it's going to be a bit of work that's going to need to be done to make sure that the jobs that are being created are good quality and suitable and lead to sustained employment.
Great. Well, I guess we might come back to some of that in discussion. Let's pass over, Martin, to you. And Martin, your book, you talk about, I guess, conceived in probably before COVID, you talk about a lot of the structural shifts that might need to go on in the context of this unemployment crisis. It would be good to hear from you about the extent to which you think there's a trade-off or there's a timing issue about when we tackle the good quality jobs question.
Yeah, I think thanks, Ian. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone who's tuning in. It's obviously the right question to ask because it seems natural to think that there is a tension or even a trade-off between the quality of jobs and the quantity of jobs. I think that is vastly overdone. To take a concrete example to fix ideas. Remember back in April there was a rise in the national living wage due, and there was some debate about whether this was wise to go ahead with. And you heard from economists, including sort of progressive types, saying, well, actually, no, we shouldn't do this now. It's going to hurt the people it's intended to help. The government went ahead anyway, and I think that was a right thing to do. And I'd like to give you three thoughts of why actually quality and quantity can go together. One is, in this particular crisis, we actually saw that the existence of a lot of low-quality jobs or low-quality work, because they have different forms, in Britain may have actually made the quantity problem worse as well, because we know that with informal work, with irregular work, it's actually a lot harder to help people when they need help. And everyone agreed they needed help in the lockdown. But here and many other countries, people in non-conventional sort of employment relationships, it turned out to be actually hard to get money out of them. That will have added to the fall in demand, which in turn would have made conditions worse for hiring in general. So on the negative side, actually quality can itself be something that makes quantity harder to achieve or protect. The second thought is that in normal times, the tension is probably a lot lesser than people sometimes think. And we can see this again, think about the minimum wage experience or wage floor experience. There has traditionally been a fear that when you push up wage floors, you end up making people unemployed rather than giving them a better job. More and more evidence keeps accumulating that this is not the case. You don't actually get an employment or unemployment effect from higher wage floors. What seems to happen is, to some extent, employers actually adjust and try to make the way they use workers more productive in order to be able to justify the higher cost. And you see this in a cross-country comparative perspective too. If you look at the Nordic countries that have not minimum wages, but high wage floors through collective bargaining, very high wages at the bottom. The result has been that companies adjust. You get a shift towards more capital intensive, more automated, more productive, smarter production methods that use that labor more productively, and therefore you can justify the higher wage. And if really there is a problem for employers in absorbing either the cost of a higher wage or the effective cost of stricter rules on labor standards, greater enforcement, more predictability of shift patterns, things like that. Some of the things Tony also talked about. One thing we can do is to cut labor taxes instead. And this, I think, would be a smart thing to do in normal times and in a crisis, because it makes it easier if we do need a shift from some sectors that can't keep going the way they did before the pandemic in a post-COVID future. We want to facilitate labor moving, workers moving from unsustainable lines of work to new ones. Now, you need to ensure that those new jobs are there. So the quantity question obviously needs to be addressed. But you do that through macroeconomic policy. You ensure that there's enough demand in the economy that those companies that have productive, good jobs will want to expand and offer more of those jobs. That's really a demand side issue. So my point is that these are two slightly different problems, but they're not in a trade-off relationship against each other. There are different tools for different things. And you can use some tools to improve quality and other tools to secure quantity. Final thought I want to leave you with is that, if anything, the exceptional situation we're in this year is, if anything, a better time to try to make these adjustments than otherwise, because the disruption has happened, right? All companies have to think about how they do things. A lot of companies will have to adjust in any case. They have to adjust to new public health rules, actually constantly changing public health rules. They need to think about what their industry will look like in the future. Now, these are difficult choices, but my point is they're already in that situation of having to make big choices about how they structure the way they use labor, so that while they're in any case restructuring how they do things, they can do that in a way that contributes to better jobs. So those are the three thoughts I'd like to kind of put on the table to argue that we shouldn't be as impressed by this idea that there's a trade-off as we often are.
Great, thank you, Martin. And Martin, just to caricature what you're saying there, I guess you're sort of saying the quantity job should be done by macroeconomic interventions, essentially, and leave the micro focus on the quality, in a sense. And I just wonder whether that is a fair characterization, and where does that leave jobs like policies like Kickstart? Is that the kind of right intervention, or is that, it seems like it's almost it's not the right intervention from your perspective? Is that
Look, I have nothing against Kickstart. If that helps some people get jobs, some young people get jobs who wouldn't otherwise get them, that's great. It just seems like very small fry to me. What you really want is a much more massive attempt at job creation, which basically means very aggressive macroeconomic policy. There are things you can do, I'm sure, to encourage hiring of specific groups, and this of course is aimed at the young, but I really think you want to put in place a system where you pump in the demand now, but you also create an expectation in the future for companies that they can expect growing demand so that they have the confidence to expand. So I think something like, let's say, cutting employers' national insurance be more expensive, but it could also be much more powerful than this small targeted thing.
Yeah. Great. Okay, let's, at that point, Stella, hand over to you.
Hi there, Ian. That's really interesting to hear from Tony and Martin. In my contribution, I guess I want to look at the other end of the telescope of this conversation and who it is who might be at risk rather than the national picture. I come at that both as a local constituency MP who has been supporting many people. 30,000 people in my community in total are either furloughed or on the self-employment scheme. So you can imagine it has been a huge transformation in our local community, but also as somebody who is desperately concerned that one of the underlying long-term challenges in the British economy has been productivity, and that is linked inexorably to inequality. And actually, one of the messages and one of the lessons I think about these last 7 months that really hasn't been teased out at a national level, and I think we can have a separate conversation about why that is about how inequality is being exacerbated in the way in which people are approaching the system. Put simply, everybody is furloughed, but some are more furloughed than others. What do I mean by that? So Tom has talked about 10 million people potentially affected by this in total. We know that we're between 2 and 4 million people who are still furloughed. I believe there's still around 3 million people who are on the self-employed scheme. And as Tom says, we know that those redundancies are coming. The redundancy figures, there's a time lag in getting them. And also obviously with 99% of jobs in the private sector in this country and small businesses, if you are an employer planning less than 20 redundancies, of course you don't have to report that. So I think the figures are woefully undercutting in terms of who might be losing their jobs. I think it's also a fair question to ask, if a tough question to ask, about whether good jobs are a viable aspiration. I think any job would be a viable aspiration for a lot of people in my local community who 7 months in either have lost their job or are on furloughed and know that their job isn't coming back. And a lot of employers have already started that conversation with people on an informal basis. And also to ask whether coronavirus is the cause or the catalyst of change, whether actually in of itself. And I think there are some sectors where you can say absolutely it has been about coronavirus. You know, clearly in the hospitality, tourism sector, clearly the changes around social distancing are going to dramatically impact on your ability to continue on. I think in other sectors, there's been a long-term conversation about the decline of the high street, remote working practices and automation. The argument people say, and I've had this argument with government MPs about, well, this is the inevitable, and if we continue the furlough scheme, we're simply delaying the inevitable. But it misses the point. So for me, one of the things that we've not talked about is, although we've started to look at who might be affected, is who is at the sharp end, who are in those precarious jobs, who are in those schemes that are being furloughed. And actually very little data exists at the moment to really tease out who might be at risk of redundancy and not going back into the workforce. But what we do know is that there is an absolute hidden crisis coming our way of unemployment facing women. And in particular, not all women, but mums. The evidence that we do have shows that it's been mums who've been much more likely to be furloughed in the first place, 10 percentage points ahead of fathers when it comes to the workforce. Not the same figures showing for women who are not parents in the workforce. And we know that women are half as times as likely as men to have lost their jobs already if they are mums. We know also that it's been mums who've been trying to do the working from home whilst balancing the childcare issues. Only the studies that show us that it has been the fathers who've locked themselves away to try and keep their jobs going and the mums who've had to do the juggling. And that we know in normal times, women's jobs are always at risk when the economy is struggling. So I see coronavirus as that kind of shard of glass that is magnifying the inequalities that already underlie in our economy to disastrous effect. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that of any form of workforce, whether it is on low incomes, precarious works, or indeed women who are in boardrooms, when times are struggling, women are much less likely to maintain their employment. They're much less likely to be appointed, they're much less likely to be promoted, and they're often first in the queue for redundancy. We're already seeing that. Pregnant and Screwed is a fantastic organisation. I would encourage you to check out their research into what's happened to pregnant women during the lockdown crisis, with many of them being put onto statutory sick pay or indeed being made redundant, even though those legal protections are supposedly in existence. But we also know that 2/3 of women who are saying they'd like to go back to work if their role is unfurloughed cannot do so because there isn't any childcare. And whilst we've seen the Kickstarter scheme to try and address the fact that it's been young people who've been at the top of the list in terms of furloughing, we've seen absolutely nothing to help ensure that women can go back to jobs that may well have withstood the coronavirus crisis, but because they cannot balance work and home life anymore, will not be able to continue on. And I think one of the things that we can agree is that a good job is one that allows you to balance family and working life. This is a conversation that is simply not happening in Parliament, despite the fact that there are nearly 5 million mothers, in theory, in our workforce. I am desperately concerned that as those redundancies start to take place, this will become more and more pronounced. We know that the research, I think Resolution Foundation has started to do some research into this. We know that because we tend to measure high-level gender disaggregate, so we look at women and men, it's women's employment is being covered up by the lack of women in some of the other jobs that haven't been going. So I would love to see, as a first point, what can we do about it, is to start naming and measuring this challenge and start measuring family commitments when we're looking at the redundancies and we're looking at the furloughing, so that we can understand the true scale of the factor. I also think we need to be much smarter about the furloughing scheme. Look, absolutely, if you work in accountancy or law, then you probably are already back at work. You might be remote working. Those of us in politics, although obviously, ironically, as a woman with childcare issues, I haven't been able to go back into the chamber thanks to some of the rules that have been put together. But we know that there are some industries that have survived and adapted well, but we know disproportionately there are certain sectors and certain employees within those sectors who are at risk of redundancy and risk of never being able to get back in, even if there are new jobs, because of those external factors. So certainly I would be looking and taking a very close look at the government's job bonus retention scheme and asking if it could be better spent. It doesn't take a genius to work out that in a childcare setting, social distancing 3-year-olds isn't really going to happen. So clearly the numbers of children that you can get into childcare settings has been reduced in an industry that was already on pretty precarious budgets to begin with. We need to inject money into our childcare sector and see it as an infrastructure issue if we want to prevent the mass unemployment of mums that is coming our way in the autumn. I think we also need to be much more creative in learning from other countries. Self-employment, we haven't really talked about it, but clearly a growing part of the British economy. I've been a long-term fan of looking at things like bread funds and the Kurzarbeit system from Germany and asking if we could adapt that for the UK. I think we now need to go much further in that and look at how we can tie that up with family settings so that we can provide the remote support for families through the ups and downs that are coming. And I also think there's something simple here about how we help people set up businesses, because one of the lessons of the last 7 months has been the inconsistency in the advice. Martin, you touched on it briefly about public health. Every single time there's a late night tweet by the government about changes in lockdown, my inbox is full of people asking very simple and very fair questions about how they can keep going because it isn't clear to them. Those underlying challenges about red tape are going to continue on in this precarious situation. That's not just about public health, that's about things like late repayments. That is about, and we haven't mentioned it yet, the B word, Brexit. There's a very clear incentive here to try and make it as simple and easy as possible for people to do business from home, but also to be doing it with the home, to be doing it in a family-friendly way. One of the things that is the most depressing things to reflect on, I'll end on this, is that the only business metric that this government cancelled during this pandemic was gender pay gap reporting. That doesn't bode well in recognising the intricate link between inequality and productivity that our country has long suffered. And I fear one of the things that we might see in the months to come is that we end up spending a lot more money, not just on universal credit and trying to deal with the absolute impact of poverty and debt, because debt is massively rising, personal debt in our country, but what this means for families and for equality and our productivity in this country if we allow an entire generation of women, because they happen to have babies, to be kicked out of our labour market.
Thank you, Stella. And I think you've introduced a really important dimension to this, in that, you know, many of these policies, if we look at them through this kind of lens of just there's people are unemployed and we need to get back to work, then you miss kind of hugely diverse effects that it's having on different groups of people. But what are the what kind of specific interventions do you think are missing as part of this, the kind of the policy approach then? Is it primarily a childcare story, or what kind of things would be on your wish list?
Well, I think absolutely childcare. Look, we need an injection into the childcare industry into this country. Many of them were already going to the wall. Many of them were furloughing staff. They need physical spaces to be able to run childcare in the same way that our schools did. I've raised this repeatedly in Parliament and got blank faces from Treasury ministers who seem to think that allowing childcare settings to furlough is enough without recognising this point about spaces. You simply cannot have the same number of children in the same spaces if you are going to do social distancing. But as I say, that doesn't necessarily help people and mums who are self-employed. And I think the bread funds model from the Netherlands is a really interesting one. It's one, I think, for self-employed. I actually tried to help in Walthamstow set up a trade union for the self-employed so that people could start pooling resources. I think we have to turbocharge those ways of working, because it's the self-employed who are particularly, and I mean, I would slightly take issue with what Tony said at the beginning, just because I think there are lots of people who have been excluded, partly because we're trying to fit a one-size-fits-all model to employment. And that model is a very sort of dated model about who the primary breadwinner is and their way of working and who else can do all those caring commitments. Actually, in a lot of families, you've got a range of working practices, and in particular, this explosion in self-employment amongst women, particularly women from minority communities on low incomes. They are going to be really, really hit because they don't have the protection, they don't fit the requirements. A lot of them are working, so they have a PAYE contract as well as some self-employment because they top their incomes up, and they've been really hit by the changes. Some of them who are working in industries where they're being forced to go back, and they can't live on sick pay. Nobody can really in this country. So if quarantining is going to become a consistent thing, that's clearly going to be a challenge for people. So I think we have to be much better at understanding who actually can go back to work and how. So say, look, if you're an accountant or a lawyer, you can work remotely. And it is right that the government is saying, look, actually the scheme now needs to wind down for you. But if you are somebody with multiple incomes, because that's how you fit family life around, you do bits and pieces of what people would call piecework, none of that conversation is taking place. And indeed, the more the Treasury tries to force people down and single out, for the more those are the people who are going to be on the cliff edge. The other thing I would say about those people, they're also the people whom housing costs are absolutely the cutting edge between whether you take a job or you stay at home, and particularly in London. And with the end of the eviction ban, that's also going to be another cliff edge coming our way.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, look, before we, if people on the line want to type in their questions, please stick them in the Q&A box, and I will come to you to unmute you. But if I could just start off with a general question to the panel. I mean, we talked there about the kind of role of macroeconomic stimulus, the importance of enforcement, the kind of suite of policies you might need at an individual level to deal with different people with different needs to access the labour market. But one thing I guess we haven't talked about that much in terms of the quality agenda is what is it that's going to cause business models to move or to change compared to what we had before the crisis. So you know, we had a rise in the use of self-employed, 0 hours contracts, all the rest of it, various precarious forms of employment. But what is it that on their side, I mean, hasn't this crisis really proven to them that the ability to be able to pass the risk on to labour is quite useful, because when a crisis hits, you can just get rid of them. So, you know, what is it that's actually going to change that incentive structure, or is there anything? I mean, maybe Tony, Martin, I don't know whether you think that the NIC's intervention is sufficient, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can give a very quick answer to that in a sort of broad perspective. I think what will change it is a combination of advanced knowledge that they won't be allowed to get away with these things anymore. So rule changes that say you actually have to take some of that risk yourself. You need to give shift patterns in advance, for example. Combined with a commitment to strong macroeconomic support from the government, so that you can have some confidence that actually there will be customers wanting to buy whatever it is you're providing, goods, services. If we can give as many employers or self-employed small business owners as well, a combined kind of advanced look at where we're going to be 1, 2, 3 years down the line, an expectation that actually you won't be able to get away with pushing all the risk over on employees. So you'd better get ready for that. But you also have a believable, a credible promise that there'll be so much macroeconomic support for the economy that there will be demand for whatever it is you provide. I mean, that's the kind of combined combined outlook you want that will make employers move in the direction that I think we all agree we'd like to see.
And just to add to that, I think, I mean, I completely agree with that. We also need much better, more consistent and more visible enforcement of the law. And the move to a single enforcement body, should help with that. But I think this crisis has also shown, some of the really unsatisfactory ways that health and safety laws being enforced and being implemented, and in particular where things are falling between local enforcement responsibilities and national enforcement responsibilities, and the underinvestment in enforcement over the last more than a decade probably. But so I think there's also a point about making sure that employers know that the law's there to be enforced. There's some really good examples actually where CIPD were doing work around providing support to SMEs to improve their HR capability, which links to a sort of point too about, I think part of the answer, which sort of ties in with what Martin was saying earlier, is also about trying to support employers to be better as employers, to recognise the business benefits, even in low-paying sectors, of investing more in their people, of being better employers, offering better terms and conditions. But the one really big takeaway finding from that work, which was, there were a lot of positives from it, but the really big takeaway was that a lot of SMEs just simply weren't compliant with the law, with basic employment law. So we also have to think about the role that local government plays, and other local partners and chambers of commerce and others play, working with SMEs to try and make sure that employers are doing the right thing.
Okay, great. Let's open up to some other questions, and let's go first. I'll go first to Rebecca Deegan. Rebecca's got a question about the role of smaller organisations and smaller SMEs in tackling the crisis. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask what the panel's views are about whether the government's various back to work and employment schemes favour big organisations who perhaps least need these incentives over micro businesses and SMEs. So I am a social entrepreneur. I run a social enterprise called I Have a Voice, and I work virtually on site and sometimes in shared office spaces, as opposed to having my own premises. And this precludes me from taking on a trainee or apprenticeship or taking part in the Kickstarter scheme. As a micro business, I feel like I can offer someone one-to-one coaching and really varied and dynamic employment opportunity, as I'm sure many of the 5.6 million micro businesses in the UK could if they were able to do so. Given many of us are now working online, is this idea of needing a set premises to offer a quality employment opportunity outdated, and providing, of course, they meet the basic requirements of employment laws was just mentioned.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's a really interesting point in the age of when everyone's on Zoom the whole time. Having to have a premises is outdated. Let me collect another one here as well from Mike Herity, because Mike's asking about older workers and retraining. Mike, do you want to ask your question?
I think Stella made some excellent points earlier on. I thought quite innovative, particularly sort of issues that I think, for example, childcare. I think that's an infrastructure issue as much sort of internet access, etc. But one issue I'm particularly interested in is being an older employee, as it were, is about, quite rightly, sort of younger generation has been hopefully been targeted here. But what about us older workers who, for example, have valuable life experience, but maybe just need to retraining yourself?
I think you're breaking.
I could, for example, be get involved in, for example, computer retraining or whatever, and that would maybe then sums of money could be put across to training organisations, which in many cases are small SMEs, who could themselves be sort of getting up in business for it as well. Any thoughts in that way?
Thanks, Mike. And then let's just take one more from Stephen Evans. Stephen's got a question about minimum wages. Stephen, I'll let you ask it.
Great, thanks, Ian. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Fab. So yeah, I was interested in the point about minimum wages and enforcement, and so I run the Learning and Work Institute, which does lots of research into labour markets and skills, and we looked at minimum wages for apprentices as an example, and found that 20% of apprentices reported being paid below their legal minimum wage limits. And we then spoke to employers and found that actually quite a lot of them didn't understand the rules and how things switched as you moved between ages, and when you got into the second year of an apprenticeship you had a different entitlement and all these sorts of things. So there's something about enforcement, and I agree with the points made already about that, but how do we promote compliance in the first place by getting individuals to understand what they're entitled to, and also employers to understand the rules? Of course it's their responsibility, but how do we get them to understand that a bit more clearly, and whose responsibility is that? I heard local authorities mentioned. We did some work with Newham Council to build an employment rights centre, so to give people somewhere to go to understand what they're entitled to. Is it a local authority responsibility? Could chambers of commerce do more? How do we help individuals and employers to understand what they're entitled to on minimum wages, but also, I guess, employment rights more generally?
Okay, great. So we've got three there on smaller organisations and participation in employment schemes, older workers, and minimum wage enforcement. Who would like to kick us off? Stella, I don't know whether you want to wade in first on those.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rebecca is absolutely right to flag it. One of the things about the Kickstarter scheme is it requires you to offer 30 places for young people, which immediately discounts a large number of organisations from taking part. They might be able to offer, unless they can be part of a coalition. Of course, that creates, again, more red tape, more bureaucracy. Now, you know, the Future Jobs Fund had a similar requirement, but that was 10 years ago in an environment where the numbers of small businesses has just rocketed over the last 10 years, partly as a response to the way in which the public sector has changed. I think, again, one of the stories that will be told about this lockdown is the lack of enforcement across the piece more generally. I've seen constituents who've been asked to pay for their own furloughing. I have seen companies that are clearly based overseas claiming money for grants for the coronavirus jobs retention scheme, and still demanding rent from tenants, for example, but putting that money overseas themselves. And the HMRC has very little kind of muscular intervention in this, let alone with the minimum wage foundation. So I think absolutely there is a question mark here about whether the way in which it was intended to support good employers has then been followed up. And I think Rebecca is right to be frustrated as somebody from particularly from I mean, social enterprises weren't even part of the matrix to begin with, and we had to fight very hard. I'm a co-op as well as Labour MP. We had to fight very hard for them to be talked about at all. So I do think there is a massive missed opportunity to recognise how you make it easy for, as I say, 99% of jobs in the private sector are in small businesses. You don't want to miss out on 99% of potential future employers because you've said that there's this artificial barrier about 30 because it makes it easier to administer. I think Mike's also right about older workers. Again, we are prioritising particular groups of employees on the basis that, well, you know, if you're a young person and therefore you're out of the jobs market for a length of time, that is terminal, and missing out on the fact that that's now the case for most people because our jobs market is increasingly precarious. So I think the Kickstarter scheme, I mean, I would be looking just in the same way I'm looking for support for mums. I'd be looking for much more targeted support for particular sectors and for that retraining ethos. That's why I think the bread funds and the Kurzarbeit models are the way to go. This is going to require long-term partnerships between employers, the state and employees as we transition. And the sooner that we start to build that up and that way of working so that people actually have access to that funding to be able to make that transition themselves, I think the more likely we are not only just to protect jobs and minimise the number of job losses, but also the psychological impact on people of having to retrain. You know, we were talking before everyone came on live, it's very easy to ask other people to adjust to a changing jobs market and to adjust to what they've learned to do all their lives. Try doing it yourselves and you'll recognise that we need to be much better at supporting people earlier on in the process.
Thanks, Stella. Tony, you probably have comments on this. I might also throw in, Mike talked about older workers, and there's a question here from Lisa Tompkins about the increased competition for jobs between you know, young workers coming into the labour market and older workers, and actually asked a sort of a question that's a bit the other direction to Mike's, saying is later retirement ages, do they need to be revisited in this context? So I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I certainly can do in a minute. On the so I mean, sort of picking up on Stella's points too, which I really agree with. I do think one of the things this crisis has shown is, because we've relied on really blunt instruments that are largely at the discretion of employers, is the extent of that imbalance between the employer and the worker. And the fact that if people aren't aware of their entitlements, they've got very little means, and even where they are aware of them, they've got very little means of enforcing them. And a good example actually is, if you think your workplace is unsafe, legally you don't have to go back to work. So the 1996 Employment Act, Section 44, if you think your workplace is unsafe, then you don't have to work there, and that applies in coronavirus. But of course, what does that mean in practice? That means if you choose not to go back to work and your employer sacks you, you would have grounds to take them to tribunal. Well, that's no good for anyone, really. If you're in low-paid, insecure work in the middle of a recession, why would you choose to fall into a dispute with your employer and lose your job? But we also found in the interviews we had with low-paid workers, where people were raising issues, employers didn't always address them. Many did, but others didn't. But also sometimes people weren't aware of their entitlements, like agency workers who didn't know that they were entitled to be furloughed, and whose agencies obviously didn't have an incentive to furlough them. So I think as we move forward, we need to think much more about how we can put some of these things on a more of a statutory and entitlement-based grounds. And this also comes back to the point about working mothers in particular, who were significantly more likely to initiate furlough. About a quarter of working mums who were furloughed asked to be furloughed, compared with about 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 of working dads. Now that just puts it entirely at the discretion of the employer whether they offer that or not. So we do, this has to be a kind of a right to have, and ideally I don't think this would be through an employer run scheme. Ideally we do this through statutory entitlements. So just picking up on Stephen's point though about making people aware of entitlements, and I think when it gets to the point of citizens' advice or a welfare advice service doing that, then clearly it's too late in a sense, isn't it? I mean, the point on the apprenticeships point, I wonder if there's more we should be expecting of colleges and training providers, for example, to be making sure that employers are aware of this, given that they should be maintaining contact with their workers. But there's a much broader point about who do SMEs go to, particularly micro businesses, small employers go to, and who can provide them with that support. And the CIPD research I mentioned is a really good example that showed that there aren't really sources for them to go to. They're not getting the right advice. And I do think local government, chambers of commerce and other local partnerships have got a much stronger role to play. Point about older people, I agree with Mike. I mean, I didn't mention about kind of training and lifelong learning in my earlier comments, but that was, the plan for jobs was really weak on that. We're really short of the mark, I think, in terms of new investment in retraining and adult skills support. And I think for older people in particular, that needs, we need to think about how we can better tailor that to people's needs, because in large scale general programs like the work program as an example, older people have stood out as a group that have been really badly served, with much lower outcomes. I don't think that's an argument for saying we should pension off older people to create more jobs for younger people, because I just don't think that's how the jobs market works. I think there's room for everyone. I think it's positive to have people who are productive, who want to work, who are in work, and that creates jobs for other people too.
Great. Martin, do you want to come in on any of those, or should I take another round?
Just very quickly on older people. I mean, what we know is that as the economy goes in cycles, it's marginalized groups get fired first and hired last, and that includes the young, but it also includes older people, perhaps in particular older people with less formal education. So I just want to bring back to the table the issue of macroeconomic policy. Right? You need to make sure that there's enough demand growth in the economy, that even those who will not be the first to be hired, that they will still get jobs. And just on trading, I think we missed a bit of a trick in the lockdown. Here we furloughed millions of people who were paid to have nothing to do. I mean, they could have taken some training, certainly computer skills for older people who may not have them. It was sort of an obvious thing to do that didn't really happen. But these opportunities, we just don't take them often enough when they're there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, let's go for another round. Might go first to Mariana Masters, who's got a question about race audits when it comes to redundancies, which I think is a very interesting angle. Mariana, if I unmute you, you can ask your question.
Great, thank you very much. Just actually touching on Martin's, the previous panelist's point about vulnerable groups being the first to sort of be made redundant and the last to take up jobs. It's particularly true of Black and minority ethnic workers. Unite did a recent survey of the BA job losses and found that there was disproportionately Black people being made redundant to white co-workers. And I just feel that as well with COVID, it's as Stella touched on, it's sort of made structural inequalities sort of be so visible that we really need to not forget people that have already been marginalised. We made great attempts to sort of clap for key workers who are highly proportioned, are sort of Black and ethnic minority workers, and yet in this downturn, I think that there's a danger that will be forgotten, and that 1980s unemployment levels amongst this group will skyrocket.
It's a really interesting, important question. Let's go next to another dimension on this. Nick Fairclough has a question about the geographical angle here. Nick, if I unmute you.
So my question was about the geographical dimension in all this. We've seen that COVID-19 has a widespread impact, but often the areas that have had the worst outbreaks are those that were already economically challenged before COVID came along. If you look at, I'm in Greater Manchester, if you look at some of the areas here that have been affected by the worst outbreaks, they were the areas that were amongst the most deprived anyway. And what it's done is it's exacerbated pre-existing inequalities in many of those areas. In order to counter the outbreaks in those areas, what we've seen is more extensive, more severe lockdowns and restrictions. So, for example, in Bolton at the moment, you'll see that there's been a curfew of sorts put in place, and hospitality businesses have had to close. What can we do at a local level to support the economies of those places where, as the PHE report that was leaked over the weekend suggested, COVID-19 spread is almost endemic?
Great, thanks, Nick. And finally, I'll just come to Lizzie, who's got a question. Lizzie Insall, who's got a question on what we can learn from past programmes.
Hiya. Yeah, thanks very much for your interesting comments, everybody. I guess my question was a bit more about kind of one of the age-old problems that plagues these kind of programmes from government is about value for money and the risk of putting money into places where jobs would be being created anyway. And I guess the concern that we could have at the moment is the fact that the places where those jobs are coming are looking like they're the places that provide more traditionally sort of insecure work. So we see huge growth of jobs in supermarkets as like online delivery really kind of continues to grow. And I guess I just wonder what you think we can learn from previous programmes, both about how we ensure kind of value for money in getting genuinely new jobs, but whether there's work that government should be doing in sort of targeting specific sectors or things like that to try and make sure those are more of the quality jobs.
Great, thanks, Lizzie. So there's a really good range of questions there that's probably going to take us to time. So if I could ask each of the panelists to pick up on whichever of those they feel they can cover and then give any final reflections, that would be fantastic. So I'll go in the order we start. Or Martin, do you want to kick off if you
sorry, since I already raised my hand before you said something about the order, I'll try and be brief. I just wanted to reflect on the comment about minorities also being among the marginalized groups, and I wanted to just bring in a little bit of good news, some very rare good news from the US, because part of what I do is to kind of compare countries. In the US, of course, these problems are also enormous, discrimination and exclusion of minorities. The Federal Reserve, the US central bank, just in the last couple of weeks, made a big change to how it thinks about policy. And it said, previously when we saw unemployment come down, we started getting nervous, so we started raising rates, so we wouldn't trigger inflation. And they've been through a process of a couple of years doing these very impressively empathetic listening exercises, going out to marginalized communities and see what has our policy done to you, and found that by letting this stimulus, the monetary stimulus, stay in place, people, especially from ethnic minority communities, were being brought into the labor market in a way that they hadn't been in the past. And this has now been adopted into a formal change. We're not going to worry about unemployment getting too low so long as we don't really see inflation. I just bring that in to say how policy can change, even at a sort of very abstract national level, in a way that can have real effects when complemented with some of these other things we've talked about. So there are kind of faraway national policy changes that can actually have that sort of impact. So, you know, I just leave you with this idea that in addition to the micro and work-oriented policy things we've talked about, just getting the government, both the central bank, the Bank of England, and parliamentarians, to worry a bit less about debt, a bit less about inflation, and see that they have a role in really, you know, running the economy at as high a speed as they can, will have good effects.
Okay, Tony, do you want to go next, and then I'll come to Stella to finish off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and picking up the point about impacts on Black and minority ethnic groups, at the moment it is really hard to know what's going on in the data, and it is jumping around a lot. And the labour force survey data kind of counterintuitively showed the employment rate gap between Black and minority ethnic groups and the white population narrowing in April and June compared with January to March. And it showed it also narrowing for disabled people against non-disabled people, which kind of ran counter to what we'd expect and what we've heard and what we've seen. But that's not to say that we won't see those impacts in the future, because we know that people from ethnic minority groups are overrepresented in low-paid work. We think that they're at greater risk of redundancy from the data that we've seen. And we know that in a general slowdown, it tends to be disadvantaged groups who fall further behind in hiring and see unemployment rise more quickly. So I'm quite attracted to the idea of asking employers to report on what they know about when they're completing their HR1 forms to tell the insolvency service. So to report on the demographic characteristics of who's at risk of redundancy, and for us to then be able to monitor that and respond to that. I do think we also really, you know, we've really over the last 10 years, we've seen a massive disinvestment in specialist support for disadvantaged groups, employment, you know, for those who are out of work, and that's, you know, that needs to be very specialist and locally driven, I think, and that ties in with the point about sort of local impacts. I think, you know, the economic impact can be different in different places, but so is the nature of the virus and how that will both, you know, the prevalence of the virus, but also the impacts that it has on different industries and different geographies. So I think, you know, that again points to the real importance of better, more integrated and aligned local responses, and in particular of Job Centre Plus and employment services to be working much more cooperatively with local government, local partnerships, and in, you know, the case of places like GM, the combined authorities, and in London, you know, with the GLA. So I think, you know, really. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the final thought for me is I think how we support, in particular, disadvantaged groups coming out of this crisis is going to be really important. I think it will start to feel like just a very large recession and less like an ongoing pandemic, and we need to treat it in that way, I think.
Great. Stella, final word to you.
Thank you, Ian. So I think what Marianne is saying, I want to reinforce what Marianne is saying, because she's absolutely right. For me, this is another good example of where, because we tend to treat disadvantage as an amorphous group that you occasionally break down into big chunks, we miss the bigger picture. Actually, the evidence we have got is that it is Asian or Asian British employees who've been much more likely to be made redundant rather than furloughed. But again, if we use those terrible catch-all terms like BAME in the same way we use just women, we miss what's going on with particular groups and therefore what we can do to challenge it. I want to strike a note of pessimism and then strike a note of optimism. My pessimism is that, and I think Martin's absolutely right to want a strong interventionist approach to the economy. My worry is if we do not deal with the underlying inequalities and underlying discrimination within our society, those jobs will not trickle down to those people who we're talking about who are particularly disadvantaged. We will still see the precariousness that we've seen over the last 10 years when we have had job creation. I think it is absolutely right that we start asking some very difficult questions of employers, not just in terms of the decisions they're making about redundancy, but ourselves in terms of the protections that people have from redundancy, because this is not a question of making people who are talented redundant. This is about making people who are more difficult to employ redundant, whether they have childcare needs or whether the discrimination that we face in society is part of it. On a more positive note, look, I think actually there are solutions to this. None of this is rocket science. You're right to talk about it as being like a very long recession. And we know there are things that we can do to support people to transition. Frankly, I personally think the people of Bolton should be able to sue the government, given that they've had 4 different variations of what lockdown should look like for them in the last 12 days alone. What business can operate in that uncertainty? And they are absolutely owed an apology and an investment strategy. I also think the fact that we've got ministers, sorry to be political about this, being issued with ministerial directions about some of the job creation schemes they've got tells us that we've not got value for money right. But actually, we do know what works. We know that training, we know that investment supports. I'm not a fan of the universal basic income, but I am a fan of what's been going on in some areas of France prior to the pandemic, where they looked at areas where they had long-term job decline and invested in entire communities. We used to, in this country, call it the New Deal for communities, but we kept that money at a local government level. I actually think if we invest it directly in people in that way, in a time-limited way, that could be a really radical and innovative way to deal with some of these challenges. The point is, there are models out there that have worked that could be adapted to 2020, because it's 2020, not 2010, but it requires a government to recognise that you cannot do this from the centre, or indeed from a small room in number 10 with lots of computer screens. You are going to have to work with local people. You are going to have to see the people, see the diversity of the people who are losing their jobs, and have that better data that we just don't have at the moment. And you're going to have to make productivity a priority. They haven't at the moment, and that's where the real challenge, I think, lies. And it's for people like myself to keep pushing and holding them to account and exposing that and saying, actually, if we allow whole swathes of the country, whether they're because of their age, because of their childcare commitments, or because of their ethnicity, to be cut out of our jobs market, it is a false economy, to say the least. I think that conversation can start, but it needs seminars like this and these people like yourselves to start holding people to account and stop saying simply, well, is it enough just to have a single scheme? Because it's clear that a single scheme doesn't work in a diverse country like Britain anymore.
Great. Well, we are over time, so sorry for that, but I think you'll all agree it's been worth it. And I've certainly heard some convincing arguments and some fascinating insights into how it doesn't need to be a trade-off between quantity and quality, but also really brought home the dimensions that we need to think about and embed within policy, rather than just thinking of this as an amorphous group of the unemployment challenge. We need to break it down much more. So it's been a fascinatingly insightful discussion. We've got a number of other seminars lined up for the next few weeks, so please do go to our website and our events page and sign up for those. But in the meantime, let's thank our panel, and I would say in the usual way, but no one will be able to hear you clap. But thanks all, and we look forward to seeing you and having you back again soon. Thank you very much.